Now to our exclusive interview with General Martin Dempsey, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I met with this country's top military officer at the Pentagon on Friday. We talked while the two hostage standoffs in Paris were still going on. We discussed that and the range of other national security challenges he faces. General Dempsey, welcome to Fox News Sunday.
It's good to see you again, Chris.
Let's start with the terrible attack on the newspaper in Paris. How much training did the two brothers get in the Middle East, terror training, and was this attack directed either by Al-Qaeda or ISIS?
These individuals were inspired in some way. They were probably not self-radicalized on the internet, which is another way that these attacks sometimes occur. There is pretty clear indication that one of them did in fact receive some training in Yemen, and that there's a linkage among them, whether it's schools or family relationships. As far as whether it was directed by Al-Qaeda, I don't think that linkage has been established.
What can you in the military do to prevent attacks like this here in the U.S.? Do we need to step up our efforts against AQAP or ISIS? And does this contradict President Obama's contention that we have Al-Qaeda on the run?
Fundamentally, our capabilities are designed so that the country can play an away game against its adversaries. And so what we try to do across this, this swath of radical extremism that stretches really from the Fatah, and I suppose we might say all the way over to Nigeria, we try to keep pressure on that network with the suite of capabilities that we have, whether it's intelligence, building partners, in some cases direct action.
Do we need to do more?
Well, I think so, absolutely. But that's not to imply we're not doing enough, if you understand the distinction there. We're doing a lot. I do think that this organization called ISIL, or Daesh in Arabic, they are inspiring groups that already exist to rebrand themselves. But in rebranding themselves, they rebrand themselves into a more radical ideology, and that's what makes it dangerous.
This would seem to me to be the definition of asymmetric warfare. You are the commander of the greatest military in the world, and yet you can have a handful of gunmen who can terrorize and lock down a great city like Paris and a country like France. How frustrating for you as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs when you're fighting in such an asymmetric way?
Well, that's the very definition of terrorism, right? It's a group that lacks the advantages of those who they are attacking. And as you say, we are the most powerful military, the most powerful nation in the world. And as a result of that, we tend to be a target for groups. And I wouldn't say it's just asymmetric. I mean, this is some combination of using asymmetric capabilities, whether it's in the media space, cyber, some of our intelligence advantages, or in some cases conventional.
How are we doing in the war against ISIS in pushing them back from the territory they took over the last year and in destroying it?
One of the things I said right from the start was that a group that embraces such a radical ideology has to maintain momentum in order to succeed, in order to maintain its credibility with the very people it's trying to influence. So tactically, we've destroyed a lot of their equipment. We've reversed some of their territorial gains. We've had an impact on their leadership and their command and control and their logistics. What will eventually cause the defeat of ISIL is that it will collapse under its own contradictions, frankly, when the populations in which it tries to maneuver realize that that ideology is not to their future benefit. But I will tell you, we have 9 lines of effort: counter-financing, counter-foreign fighter, counter-messaging, reconstruction. 3 military lines of effort that tend to get all the attention. But I will say the other lines of effort may be more important than the military lines of effort.
While President Obama has drawn a pretty firm line, no U.S. combat boots on the ground in Iraq, you have refused to take that off the table. The Iraqi army talks about taking back Mosul, the second biggest city in the country, over the next few months. Can they possibly do that without U.S. combat troops alongside them?
Here's the reality of the campaign in Iraq. It's the government of Iraq's strategy enabled by us. It's not our strategy. And I'm telling you, that is an extraordinarily important distinction. And we think that's going to be months. I don't know whether several months or not. I think several, maybe, if you're implying 3 or 4, it may take a bit longer than that to marshal all of these different resources.
Are we going to need U.S. troops to help?
I don't know the answer to that yet. And I've said that if we get to the point where I think that because of the complexity of the objective, that precision fires would only be possible with the presence of a JTAC or a forward observer, then I'll make that recommendation. But we're months away from that.
Let's turn to Syria. You say we can't defeat ISIS just with airstrikes. But with the Syrian moderate rebels suffering such serious losses, especially in recent weeks, is there going to be any moderate Syrian opposition to train to confront ISIS on the ground?
Well, that's a fair question, and one that we grapple with. The Syrian opposition is under enormous pressure, in particular in the north. And it's the north where I have my greatest concern about the ability to attract and recruit and vet a moderate opposition.
Militarily, at some point, don't you have to confront Assad and his attacks on the moderate rebels, or else you're not going to have a force to oppose ISIS?
Yeah, militarily, my job is to provide the president and our elected leaders the option, should they choose to confront Assad, and that decision has not been taken.
But we could do it if you were given the order.
Of course we could.
We just ended our combat role in Afghanistan, and on Christmas Day, President Obama addressed some troops in Hawaii, and he told them this.
Afghanistan has a chance to rebuild its own country. We are safer. It's not going to be a source of terrorist attacks again.
General Dempsey, how can the president say that so flatly, that Afghanistan will not be the source of terrorist attacks again?
Well, I mean, you'd have to ask the president how he can say that. But if you're asking me about...
Would you say that?
If you're asking me about let me give you my impression of where we are in Afghanistan. We've got a very credible and cooperative partner in the new president and the new chief executive officer. We've got Afghan security forces who have demonstrated their willingness to stand and fight. I personally think there will be pockets inside of Afghanistan that change hands from time to time, because that's the history of the country. But I think that we're in a very good place in Afghanistan in terms of giving them a chance to do exactly what the president said. But we're going to have to keep an eye on it.
And you certainly wouldn't say the threat of terrorism from Afghanistan is gone.
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as the senior military leader of the nation, tends to be rather cautious and careful, and he also tends to be a little paranoid. And, you know, terrorism can ebb and flow. I mean, it may not be there now, and it could be there tomorrow. So that's when I said earlier, we got to keep an eye on this, we got to keep an eye on this, and we've got to recognize that terrorism flows where instability lurks.
The Military Times asked active duty service members last month how they thought the commander-in-chief was doing his job. 55% say they did not approve of President Obama's performance as commander-in-chief. Only 15% said yes, which was the lowest number of his presidency. Why do, in your opinion, so many service members have doubts about this president?
What I tell the troops when I travel around is the commander-in-chief supports their efforts, and that I can tell them with great confidence that he takes, you know, this issue of whether or not I'm being micromanaged, right?
You know, it's not just the troops on the ground. You've had the two last secretaries of defense, Panetta and Gates, both wrote searing books in which they criticized the White House for micromanaging, jumping the chain of command, and for sometimes emphasizing politics over policy. Are they right?
You mean, am I being micromanaged? Is that the question?
It's one of the questions.
Yeah. If you're asking me if I'm being micromanaged, I don't know. I better go check with the White House before I answer the question. Look, it's the wrong metric in terms of defining the relationship between the military and our elected leaders. What I can tell you is the metric that we should be focused on is access and whether my advice influences decisions. I have frequent access to the commander-in-chief. I feel no constraints in providing my advice to him, and that my advice over the past 3.5 years has influenced his decisions. You know, whether someone wants to characterize the desire, the almost insatiable appetite for information about complex issues as micromanaging, they can have at it. But for me, the metric is access and advice.
The last Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, was upset with what he said was White House pressure to release more prisoners from Guantanamo. Now, you have to sign off, or at least give a recommendation on every prisoner who is released. Given that some of the prisoners that are left now are the worst of the worst, the most dangerous, and given that, according to various estimates, the recidivism rate, the number of detainees who are released and returned to the battlefield, is up around 30%. Do you worry that this White House is in too much of a hurry to close Gitmo?
I've been in the group that believes that it's in our national interest to close Guantanamo. It does create a psychological scar on our national values. Whether it should or not, it does. What I've also said quite clearly is there are some of these detainees, in particular this kind of conflict over a protracted period, that simply should not be released. We're going to come to a point, though, where we've got dozens of these individuals who just have to be detained, and we've got to figure that out.
But you would not release them?
No, of course not.
And if you can't release them, and the U.S. Congress says you can't bring them to this country...
Isn't that a fair question for our elected leaders?
Well, doesn't that mean you have to keep Gitmo open?
Well, that's a policy decision. But there's going to be dozens of these individuals that have to be detained. Our elected officials need to find a way to detain them.
Iran. You say that a diplomatic solution is preferable, but if the talks were to fall apart, can we contain a nuclear Iran, or would we have to launch a military strike? And if so, could we take out the nuclear program in Iran militarily?
If the diplomacy fails and they move ahead to acquire a nuclear weapon, we've been pretty clear that that will be an unacceptable risk to both our own country but also to the region. And we have military capabilities in place, and we continue to keep them in readiness to, if asked, to eliminate, delay is actually the right phrase, Iran's nuclear program.
What have you learned about cyber threats from the North Korea hacking of Sony Pictures? How vulnerable are we to a cyber Pearl Harbor?
Cyber can be incredibly destructive. It can be disruptive, it can disrupt, and it can destroy. And it can destroy hardware, it can disable critical infrastructure, which could lead to loss of life. And I think those capabilities are out there. And you know, we have, in every domain, Chris, we generally enjoy a significant military advantage. But we have peer competitors in cyber.
In other words, we don't have an advantage over them.
We don't have an advantage. It's a level playing field, and that makes this chairman very uncomfortable.
What do you think of Vladimir Putin?
I actually try not to, you know, to render my opinion about heads of state. Can I speak to you about Russia? I think Russia is on a very provocative and dangerous path. I called my counterpart in Russia, and I said to him, his name is Valery Gerasimov, and I said, you know, Valery, we began our careers 40 years ago facing off across the intra-German border, East Germany, West Germany. I said, you know, don't tell me we're going to do this again.
The Pentagon budget. Under sequestration, you are set to face more spending cuts. The active Army is down from a high of 570,000 now to 510,000, and you will be down to 490,000 by September. General, is there some point at which your resources would be cut so much that you would have to say, we can no longer defend this country from the threats we face?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's called sequestration. And the analysis we've done would drive it to 420, and it could actually go lower under certain circumstances. The Budget Control Act and the sequestration mechanism is imposed on us in 2016. Yes, we will have to change our strategy, become far less able to do the things that we think the country needs us to do.
Finally, when you survey the horizon, whether it's the threat from ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other affiliated groups, Russia on the march, Iran, China, North Korea, how dangerous is this world, and how much do you worry about your ability, the military's ability, to defend our country?
So you've kind of laid out the house of horrors, right? And as in so doing, you've laid out the fact that there are state actors that could coerce us or constrain us, and there are non-state actors. What we've had to do is adapt our military to address both of those challenges. And you ask, you know, am I concerned about it? Of course I'm concerned about it. But I also want to remind everyone, we are still the most powerful nation in the world by any measure, likely to remain so, unless we talk ourselves out of it and legislate ourselves out of it with things like the Budget Control Act. And that we've been through difficult periods in our history before. What will get us through this is investing in our human capital, because we're going to have to think our way through the future, not bludgeon our way through it.
General Dempsey, first of all, thank you so much for talking with us.
Yeah.
And through you, to all of the members of the military, thank you all for your service.
Thank you, sir. Good to see you.